Fortress friends. I am going to read to you a book called Delivering Justice. It's about W.W. Law and the fight for civil rights. And it's written by Jim Haskins and illustrated by Benny Andrews. Savannah, Georgia, 1932. The smell of his grandma's biscuits lured Wesley to the kitchen. Wesley was excited because today was Thursday, the day he would see his mother. The rest of the week, she worked for a white family just outside Savannah, cooking, cleaning, and taking care of their children. This was her day off. Grandma's friend old John was sitting at the table. Wesley loved listening to the old man's stories. Old John had been born a slave. He had been taken from his mother and had never known her. He was 9, Wesley's age, when he and all the slaves were freed in 1865. Wesley felt lucky. At least he saw his own mother once a week. Easter shopping at Levees. Like this, you can see this picture. Once a year, sometime before Easter, Grandma would take Wesley downtown to Levees department store on Broughton Street to buy a nice outfit. They used a Levees charge card and then paid a little bit each month. On one shopping trip, the saleswoman would not serve them until after all the white customers had been helped. Wesley had heard the saleswoman politely call the white women customers Miss and Mrs., but she treated his grandma as if she were a child, a nobody. Wesley's grandma pretended not to notice. She was polite, but she was also proud. "Come on," she said. "It's time to go home." They left the store without buying a thing. Segregation. Back then, black people weren't treated as well as white people. Most of the time, they were kept segregated from whites. Wesley went to a separate school for black children. He had to drink from water fountains marked colored. He could not sit and eat at the Levees lunch counter. His grandma's prayers. Sometimes Wesley got angry that black people were mistreated and that no matter how hard his mother worked, they were still poor. But his grandma was always there to talk with him. She understood why he was upset, but she didn't want him to have bad feelings about himself. She said that no matter how he was treated, he had no excuse not to be somebody. She told him again about the day he was born. She said, "I got on my knees and prayed that you would grow up to be a leader of our people." Wesley promised himself that he would fulfill his grandma's prayer. He also promised himself that he would work hard so that one day his mother would not have to work in someone else's house. Wesley had a good mom and a good grandma. Voter schools, 1942. Wesley knew that many black people didn't vote because they had to pass a test to register. The test was designed to be difficult for black folks to pass. It was intended to keep them from voting. Wesley was a member of the Youth Council of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The Youth Council started a special voter school in the basement of a church. With his friend Clifford, Wesley talked to everyone, even passers-by, about voting. When he found someone who, scared by the test, had never registered to vote, he took them to the voter school. When they felt ready to take the test, Wesley went with them to the courthouse and stayed until they were registered. With Wesley's help and encouragement, many black people in Savannah became registered voters. Y'all know how important it is to vote, right? You're not old enough to vote yet, but when you turn 18, I hope the first thing you do is register to vote. And you know we have an election for our president coming up in November, and it's so important that everyone votes. Every person needs to share their voice and their opinion about who gets elected. And it's not just for president, it's also for local things and things to do with our schools and things to do with our state and things to do with our city and things to do with our nation. So voting is super important. But back then it was hard. It was harder to vote than it is today. So we should take advantage of the opportunity we have. Working as a mailman, 1949. After college and the Army, Wesley wanted to be a teacher, but because of his membership in the NAACP, no one in Savannah would hire him. So he became a mailman. The Postal Service hired qualified people regardless of their color. As it turned out, this job suited Wesley just fine. "Good morning, Miss Sally Lawrence Jenkins," Wesley sang out to a young woman in her garden. "Here's a letter from your sister." Wesley liked to address people by their full name. He would trace a person's history in their name, and history was important to Wesley. "If you don't know where you've been, how do you know where you're going?" he loved to ask. At the NAACP office, February 1960. After work, Wesley spent long evenings at the NAACP office. One night, he was visited by a group of students who were excited about what was happening in Greensboro, North Carolina. Young black people there had staged a sit-in at a lunch counter in a local store. They had refused to leave until they were served. You ever heard of a sit-in? You know how right now in Fort Worth and all across our nation and actually all across the world, people are doing peaceful protests where they march for Black Lives Matter, and they march through the city streets or they march around businesses and just try to get attention for Black Lives Matter. Well, sit-ins were a different kind of protest that they did back in the 60s, where, like we learned earlier, where Wesley said he wasn't allowed to eat at the lunch counter at Levees just because he was black. So they had sit-ins at restaurants like that where they weren't allowed to eat, but they would just go sit and be peaceful about it, but just have a protest by sitting in the restaurant where they weren't allowed to eat, just because that was so unfair and they wanted to have their voice heard about it. So that's what a sit-in is. So young black people there had staged a sit-in at a lunch counter in a local store. They had refused to leave until they were served. The students standing in front of Wesley wanted to do the same thing at the department stores on Boughton Street, but they needed a leader. Wesley remembered how his grandma had been treated at Levees, and he agreed to help. But first, the students had to be trained. They had to protest without ever using violence, even if the other side did. If they were attacked and they fought back, Wesley told them, their cause would be lost. So, here are some of the rules that he told them they needed to have for their sit-in strategy. Dress neatly. Why do you think that was important? To make a good impression so that people would take them seriously. Enter together, so they all stay together as a group. Sit together. Order politely. Do not react to insults. That is hard to do, isn't it? If somebody insults you, of course you want to get angry. You want to insult them back. That's not the right thing to do. Wesley was smart enough to know that, so that was one of the rules. And then leave together. Sounds like he was a pretty good leader, huh? I bet his grandma was proud. Levees lunch counter. After weeks of training, small groups of students made their way downtown, entered the big stores along Broughton Street, and sat down at the lunch counters. The stores refused to serve them. At Levees, the manager called the police, who arrested the students for breaking the city's segregation laws. There they are, just sitting at the counter, peacefully. But you can see the workers at the restaurant are not happy about it. Throwing down their cards. I wonder what that means, throwing down their cards. Let's see if we can find out. Wesley called a mass meeting the next Sunday at the Bolton Street Baptist Church. People filled the pews and balconies. Wesley opened the meeting with a hymn. All the voices singing together made a thunderous sound. And the mighty noise made people think that perhaps working together, they could really make something happen. Wesley spoke about the arrests of the young people at Levees. He said that things had to change, and he asked if people were ready to fight for their rights. Someone shouted, "I'll never shop at that store again!" Then someone in the balcony threw down a Levees charge card. Soon, everyone was tossing charge cards into a big pile in the church. The Boycott Begins. March 17th, 1960. The next morning, Wesley led a group downtown. They carried baskets full of charge cards. At Levees, Wesley and his group dumped the baskets of charge cards onto the sidewalk. Then Wesley announced that no black people would shop at any store on Broughton Street until they were treated equally. The great Savannah Boycott had begun. Look at all those charge cards he threw on the street that they had collected. Picket Lines. Wesley and other members of the NAACP organized a picket line every day in front of Levees. White people yelled and jeered at the protesters and tried to force them off the sidewalk. But day after day, the protesters returned. One day, a large, burly white man punched one of the demonstrators in the face and broke his jaw. But everyone remembered what Wesley had taught them. They didn't yell or fight back, no matter how much they wanted to. Wesley organized other protests. There were kneel-ins at the white churches on Sundays and wade-ins at the all-white beach at Tybee. Wesley wanted to end segregation everywhere in Savannah, in libraries, theaters, public schools, beaches, and restrooms, as well as at lunch counters. So the reason it was called a picket line, can you guess by looking at the picture? Because they were carrying these signs that are called pickets. And so they would walk in a line carrying their sign, picketing or showing their signs that had their messages on it. So some of these said, "Down with racism," "freedom," "peace," "integrate." But they didn't fight back. Talking about peaceful change. Large meetings were held every Sunday at different churches. Protesters talked about their activities. Some gave fiery speeches. The meetings became so popular that no church was big enough to hold everyone who wanted to get in. For a year and a half, no one from the black community shopped on Broughton Street. Wesley walked down the street and started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going out of business signs. The white store owners couldn't stay in business without black customers. When he delivered mail to white people, Wesley told them how much he loved Savannah. He wanted the city to be a better place for everyone. They respected Wesley. They saw how peaceful and committed to change the protesters were. And little by little, more and more white people began to sympathize with the protesters. You can make a big difference just by being polite and earning the respect of people. Then that's what gets people to listen to you. Desegregation without violence. White people in the community who supported Wesley asked what they could do to end segregation and stop the boycott. Together, leaders from the white and black communities worked out a plan. Each evening after delivering the mail, Wesley organized a group of students to sit in at a different kind of business or facility the next day. The theaters would be first, then the restaurants, then the library, and on down the line until every business had been desegregated. Sometimes angry crowds would gather, or white people would leave in protest when the black students arrived, but most of the white and black leaders stuck together. The mayor made sure that all the signs marking separate facilities for blacks and whites at City Hall, the courthouse, health department, and hospital were taken down. Remember earlier in the book where we saw that there was a different water fountain for whites and a different water fountain for blacks? They call it colored and white. Those signs were all taken down by the mayor. Unlike desegregation efforts in other cities and towns in the South, there was very little violence in Savannah, because they had a good leader. Justice delivered. On a Sunday in September 1961, Wesley had greeted the hundreds of people who arrived at a downtown Savannah church. Inside, their voices joined together to sing out, "We're soldiers in God's army." When the song ended, Wesley stood in front of the crowd. He saw his mother sitting in the front row. He saw students who had been arrested. He saw faces beaming with pride. Then he announced in a loud, clear voice, "We have triumphed!" Savannah was the first southern city in the United States to declare all its citizens equal, 3 years before the Federal Civil Rights Act made all segregation illegal. People, both black and white, saw Wesley as Savannah's hero. He had kept the protests disciplined and peaceful, even in the face of violence. Modestly, he would say, "I was just doing what every black American should be doing." Wesley Wallace Law delivered more than just the mail to the citizens of Savannah. He delivered justice, too. His grandma's prayers had been answered. So, this is a true story. This is the actual Wesley when he was grown up. There he is at his NAACP office. And it says, until his death at the age of 79 on July 29th, 2002, Wesley Wallace Law, known to most as WW, continued to fulfill his grandma's prayers. He worked tirelessly to end racial discrimination and to fight for justice. In September 1961, during the final days of the boycott, WW was fired from his job as a letter carrier when U.S. Representative G. Elliott Hagan made him a campaign issue. Hagan promised to get rid of the troublemaker from the NAACP. Was he a troublemaker? Hagan promised to get rid of the troublemaker from the NAACP, but in October, President John F. Kennedy came to his defense, and WW was reinstated with back pay. He continued to work as a mailman for 42 years. He served on the National Board of Directors of the NAACP for 30 years, and he served as president of the Georgia branch of the NAACP for 13 years. He faced intimidation and death threats. Medgar Evers, an NAACP field secretary, was murdered outside his home in Mississippi in June 1963. WW narrowly escaped an attempt on his own life when the NAACP offices in Savannah were attacked. He said he could never marry or have children because it would be too dangerous. Ever since he had been a young boy listening to the stories of his elders, he believed in the importance of history. Preserving and teaching history to young people became his crusade. In the 1970s, he began a project restoring grave sites at Laurel Grove South Cemetery, a predominantly black cemetery in Savannah. He founded the Savannah Yamacraw branch of the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History, and created the Negro Heritage Trail Tour of historic Savannah. He organized the Beach Institute Historic Neighborhood to preserve Savannah's only remaining downtown black neighborhood and to prevent black displacement from the inner city. He spearheaded efforts to restore the King Tisdale Cottage and Beach Institute. He did so much good work. In February 1996, W.W. was chosen as the only Savannian to have his likeness included in the mural on the Atlantic Centennial Olympic Wall. It was because of W.W.'s vision that the Ralph Mark Gilbert Civil Rights Museum in Savannah was established. Among the awards he received, many were for his work as a preservationist. He was awarded the Historic Savannah Foundation's Davenport Award, the first black Savannahan to receive this honor, the Distinguished Georgian Award by the Center for the Study of Georgia History, and the National Preservation Award by the National Trust for Historic Preservation for Lifetime Achievement. He was also awarded the highest honor from the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation as a pioneer in African American historic preservation efforts in Georgia and a dynamic leader in Savannah. He never took money for the public service work that he did, instead choosing to live on the small wages he earned from the United States Postal Service. He wanted to live as an ordinary citizen and teach by example, living frugally, never owning a car, never buying fancy things. He was able to fulfill his lifelong dream. He sat his mother down one day and told her that she did not have to go live and work in someone else's house anymore. She could finally stay home in the house he bought for her. Okay, this week's project. I'm sending each of you guys home an envelope, and the envelope will have a stamp on it. And I'm going to send you some paper. And I want you to write me a letter, and it'll get delivered right to my mailbox at Fortress. And I'm going to show you, there'll be a piece of paper with your envelope that'll show you how to properly address an envelope to make sure it gets to me. And I want you to write in it what you think about the story of Wesley, W.W. Law, and all of the good work he did. And I also want you to tell me what you think about the protests that are happening now, because it's not that much different from the sit-ins and the picket lines that we just read about in Delivering Justice. So I just want to know what your thoughts are. And then I'm going to write you back and mail a letter to your home. And so you can wait for the postman to deliver it to your house. I can't wait to get your letters. So I hope you liked that story. There's a lot of good history in it. Also, a lot of words you might not have known. I'm also going to send you some definitions of some of those cool words, like segregation and desegregation and a bunch of other words, which I think if you use context clues, you know what they mean, but I'm still going to give you the definitions for them. So I hope you guys are enjoying your summer, and we miss you tons at Fortress. Love you. Bye.